Hello, everybody. Our bell ringer question today is: what are the two ways that crystallization can occur? Hopefully, you have said that crystallization can occur through magma cooling and through water evaporating. Today, we're going to keep talking about minerals, but we're going to talk about how to identify different types of minerals. And our learning objective is I can describe the properties of minerals used to identify different types of minerals. So there are six main components to identifying minerals, six different properties or characteristics that we're going to look at in order to be able to tell what type of mineral we're looking at and to differentiate one type of mineral from another. So, first one we're going to talk about is density. Density is something that you've probably heard about before in science. Density is a measure of mass divided by volume. So basically, that's a fancy way of saying how much stuff do we fit in a particular space. If you've ever picked up two rocks that look like they're the same size, but one is significantly heavier than the other, that heavier rock is more dense. If you look at the two pictures here, both of them, it looks like, are made up of the same stuff, these little three-colored dots, but this one is more dense. It has more of those molecules packed into the same size space than the other box. The other box has fewer of those molecules, so it's less dense. It has less mass in its volume. So, density, one good way or one initial way to start identifying the type of mineral you're working with. Next, we're going to look at hardness. So hardness is perhaps, or hard is a word that you might use in your everyday life. But in our scientific vocabulary, hardness means the resistance to being scratched. So when you look at a mineral and you try to scratch its surface with different materials, when does it scratch and when does it not scratch? What materials won't scratch it? To measure hardness, we use something called the Mohs hardness scale, which was developed by a scientist named Moh, and it ranks from 1 to 10. 1 is the softest, and 10 is the hardest. And we have reference minerals for each of these. So 1, a Mohs hardness of 1, is what talc has. Talc is the softest mineral, and it can be very easily scratched by just about anything. You can make a dent in it with your fingernail. On the other end, the hardest known material is diamond. Diamond can only be scratched by other diamonds. That's how hard it is. So again, hardness is the resistance to being scratched. And we measure it from 1 to 10 on the Mohs hardness scale. Next, we're going to take a look at the middle column. We're going to look at cleavage and fracture. So cleavage and fracture talk about how different minerals break. Cleavage is a description of minerals that break along flat and smooth surfaces. So if we look down here at this picture of the mineral mica, mica shows cleavage planes. It breaks off in kind of like flat, like layers. They look almost like pieces of paper. Fracture is when a mineral breaks along rough or irregular surfaces. So if we look at the mineral smoky quartz right here, smoky quartz exhibits fracture. If you look really, really closely at it, actually, sometimes you can see this kind of like, they look almost like little rounded divots. That's a specific type of fracture, but it's not a flat, smooth plane. When we see breaks that are flat and smooth, that's cleavage. When we see irregular or rough breaks, that is fracture. All right, so we're going to keep looking at that middle column, and we're going to talk about color and streak. So sometimes just looking at the color of a different mineral can be a really good way to identify it. Some minerals have very distinct colors. Just like if you look over on the left side, malachite is a mineral that has a very distinct green color because it has copper in it. So if you think about like the Statue of Liberty is made out of copper. At one time, it was very shiny and kind of like bronzy colored, and now it is green because of how copper reacts with oxygen. Malachite has copper in it, so it has that bright, distinct green color. So that can be a useful tool sometimes. But there are some minerals, like quartz, that have many different variations that are all different colors. Quartz can be, like we saw on the previous slide, smoky. It can be clear. It can be rose-colored. It can be purple. It can be all sorts of different colors. So sometimes color isn't the most effective tool for helping us determine what type of mineral we're looking at. When we get to that point, it can be important to look at the streak. So the streak is the color of a mineral's powder. And if you look at the picture right above me, that is an example of why streak can be a good determinant. All 4 of the rocks in the picture look pretty similar. They're slightly different shapes, but they're kind of like this gray, maybe with some like metallic looking flecks throughout them. And each of them represent a very different type of mineral. We've got hematite, magnetite, this one right here under my head is sphalerite, and galena. They look very similar. They look like they might have the same color. But if we look at the streak, so the color of the powder left behind on this unglazed porcelain tile, the color of the powder is different for each of them. And so that can be a good way that we can distinguish between 2 minerals that have a similar color, to look at the streak. All right, we're going to move on to the last column, and we're going to talk about the luster. So luster describes the way that light interacts with the mineral's surface. So kind of how it reflects light. If you think back to when you learned about mirrors and reflection and refraction. Luster is a good example of that in real life. So we can use the luster to help us determine what type of mineral we might be looking at. And we have several different kinds of luster. I've listed 4 here, but there are even more types of or descriptions of luster that help us identify minerals. So if you look at pyrite, pyrite is sometimes called fool's gold because it looks like it's gold because it has a metallic luster, but it is not gold. It is a mineral. So it has a metallic luster, meaning that it reflects light and looks kind of like a metal. If we look at this quartz and amethyst, so amethyst is a purple variety of quartz, they have what we call a glassy luster. Or in some textbooks or some circles, people might say vitreous. If you've ever heard the term vitrine or vitre, that means window in French. So vitreous or glassy luster means it reflects light, very similar to how glass reflects light. It's almost transparent and it's got a very good reflective surface. Pearly is another luster that reminds us of pearls. If you've ever seen a pearl, it has some sort of shine. It's kind of iridescent when it kind of reflects like many different colors of light. And it's not got this, it doesn't reflect light as well as something like pyrite, as something with a metallic luster. It's shiny, but it's kind of soft looking. Barite is an example of a mineral that is pearly. And then finally, earthy. Kaolinite is an example of an earthy luster. It's kind of grainy, it doesn't really shine, it doesn't reflect light very well, it kind of has a dull looking texture. And that is what an earthy luster looks like. So luster is how the mineral's surface reflects light, and it can help us decide what kind of mineral we're looking at. All right, finally, we're going to talk about crystal shape. So this was one of the defining characteristics of what makes a mineral is that it has a definite crystal shape. But the crystal shape can actually also help us identify the type of mineral that we're looking at, because the atomic structure, so how the molecules and atoms are arranged on a molecular level, on an atomic level, that helps to determine the shape that we see. The microscopic behavior of those atoms determines the macroscopic crystal that we observe. If we look at quartz, quartz is made up of silicon and oxygen. And on a microscopic level, this is how the atoms arrange themselves. And if you look at that, it looks an awful lot like this crystal right here. It's kind of at an angle, and it's kind of got like different facets, different faces, because of how all of these atoms are arranged. If we look at salt, salt arranges itself in a very square, in a very cubic arrangement. And that translates into how we see salt cubes. We see these very square grains of salt. And then finally, if we look at ice crystals, we've got oxygen and hydrogen that arrange themselves like this. Well, that's not super surprising then why we see snowflakes form in the way that we do. They have very fixed structures that are kind of open and delicate. So the atomic structure, how the atoms are arranged, can determine the crystal shape of a different type of mineral. Right. And there you have it. Those are the 6 different properties that we look at to identify different types of minerals. So how would I use this in practice? Well, if I had 2 different mineral samples and I wasn't sure what they were, I could use a reference book and look at these 6 different properties to identify them. I could start off by measuring the densities of these 2 different minerals. And then I could measure the hardness. I could do, remember the scratch test. I can scratch its surface and see what types of materials can scratch it. And there, again, if you look at a reference book, you can find information about what types of minerals are scratched by what different materials. So can a fingernail scratch it? Can an iron nail scratch it? Can glass scratch it? And you can check your findings against reference material. Then you can try to see if it breaks easily. Otherwise, you can look at the edges and see how it's been broken. Does it have flat planes? Has it had cleavage? Or has it broken in irregular ways? Does it exhibit fracture? You can then test its color and streak, look at its colors, and if you find that it has a very unique color, again, you can look in a reference book and find out if that can give you any information. Or you can test its streak. You can grab a plain white unglazed porcelain tile and leave a streak on that tile to see if you can observe any unique color there. You can look at its luster, and you can look at its crystal shape. And by observing and recording observations about each of these 6 different properties, you can find out what the identity of a particular mineral is.